The hangar trembled under the roar of 12 Merlin engines testing on the tarmac. Hot oil and gasoline thickened the evening air, and the ground itself seemed to hum with restrained violence. At the far end of the bay, a woman in a grease-stained uniform stood perfectly still, watching a single droplet of oil trace a slow path down the silver cowling of a Spitfire Mach-9. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what she'd just done. If her modification failed, she'd be responsible for killing men already running on borrowed time. If it worked, no one would ever know her name. Her name was Evelyn Moore, U.S. Army Air Force's civilian contractor, mechanical engineer, and one of the only women on loan to the Royal Air Force's Maintenance Division in 1943. She wasn't a pilot. She didn't wear wings. But that night, on an airfield in southern England, the future of an entire squadron depended on a sliver of metal no thicker than a thumbnail, a custom-made washer she'd cut from a scrap of aluminum and slipped into the throttle linkage of a Merlin engine. A 50-cent piece of hardware that could change everything. If you like forgotten stories of American engineering and quiet courage, subscribe and stay with us, because this one almost disappeared from history. RAF Dunsfold, Surrey, autumn 1943. The airfield looked peaceful from above, a patchwork of grass runways and camouflaged hangars framed by English farmland. But on the ground, it was chaos wrapped in discipline. Trucks rattled by loaded with spare parts, mechanics cursed over seized bolts. The air reeked of cordite, oil, and mud. Every dawn brought new aircraft back from the channel, some limping, some burning, some not returning at all. Dunsfold hosted the 31st Fighter Group, flying Spitfire Mach-9s supplied under the Lend-Lease program. American pilots, British ground crews, and a handful of U.S. engineers kept the machines flying through weather, exhaustion, and the constant strain of combat readiness. The men called Evelyn Mo, short for Moore, though some jokingly said it stood for more coffee, more patience. She'd been an industrial designer in Detroit before the war, drafted into the engineering corps when aircraft needed every clever hand they could find. She didn't belong to the military hierarchy, yet somehow she belonged everywhere. Crouched in the mud beside mechanics, sleeves rolled past her elbows, face streaked with graphite. She spoke the language of torque wrenches and pressure gauges better than rank or protocol. And lately, she'd been worried. Over the past month, she'd seen too many Spitfires come back scorched and silent, engines seized mid-combat. The reports all read the same. Engine failure under high boost. Pilots blamed fuel mixture, ground crews blamed over-revving, headquarters blamed pilot error. Evelyn didn't believe any of it. The Merlin 61 engine was a masterpiece. Temperamental, yes, but reliable when handled right. Something else was happening, something mechanical, buried in the throttle control or supercharger assembly. One evening, she found a clue. A pilot named Lieutenant Jack Carmichael taxied in after a scramble over the channel. His Spitfire's engine was still ticking, cooling down in uneven pulses. Evelyn climbed onto the wing, shouting over the noise. "Jack, did she cut out again when you leveled off?" "Not cut out," he shouted back. "Felt like she stuck. Couldn't get full boost back after the dive." That word, stuck, set her mind racing. After the flight line emptied, she crawled beneath the cowlings with a flashlight. The linkage between the throttle lever and the boost control housing was worn smooth, the pivot point rattling in its mount. When the pilot jammed the throttle forward, the rod flexed just enough to bind against the housing, choking the airflow, starving the cylinders, and locking the engine at a deadly mid-power setting. At 20,000 feet, that half-second hesitation meant death. She measured the gap. 0.04 to 1 inches. It didn't sound like much, but in an engine running at 3,000 RPM, that tiny sliver was the difference between a climbing Spitfire and a falling one. By regulation, she was supposed to file a report. wait for engineering clearance from Rolls-Royce or the Air Ministry, a process that could take months. In wartime, that might as well be forever. That night, she sat alone at her workbench, the sound of distant bombers echoing like thunder. The men were playing cards in the mess. Someone's phonograph played a crackling Glenn Miller record. She held the damaged throttle rod in one hand and turned it under the lamp. The solution came not like a flash, but like an inevitability. Something her father used to say while fixing farm engines back in Michigan. If it moves where it shouldn't, give it a washer to mind its manners. She opened a tin of spare hardware, rummaging through bolts and shims until she found a thin disc of aluminum. An odd size, not standard issue. It would fit perfectly between the control bracket and the throttle linkage, taking up the slack. She could machine it properly tomorrow, mark it as per-spec repair, and no one would ever know. She turned the washer in her fingers. It was worth maybe 50 cents, and maybe 2,000 lives. She exhaled, set the washer on the table, and whispered, "Tomorrow." Dawn was colorless and cold, the kind of morning that turned coffee into steam before it hit your lips. A low fog hugged the runways, muffling the drone of idling engines. Mechanics moved like ghosts through the mist, their coveralls stained with oil and graphite. Somewhere beyond the hangars, an air raid siren moaned, distant but constant, Germany reminding them it was still out there. Evelyn Moore hadn't slept. The washer, her washer, lay in her pocket, warm from her hand. She'd spent the night in the workshop watching the light fade from the windows and come back again. Around her were the sounds of the waking base, the cough of a Merlin engine, a wrench clattering against concrete, the crackle of a radio operator testing the morning frequency. She looked out across the field and saw pilots lining up for briefing, their faces pale under their helmets, eyes rimmed with fatigue. Men who measured their futures in missions, not years. "Morning, Mo," a mechanic called out. It was Corporal Dan Heller, a wiry man from Kansas who'd been fixing planes since before the war. "You look like hell." She forced a smile. "Didn't get much sleep. Thinking about that linkage problem." He shrugged. "Command says it's pilot error. Says we're wasting time worrying." "Yeah," she murmured. "Tell that to the 6 we buried last week." She walked to the hangar where Lieutenant Carmichael's Spitfire waited, the same one that had nearly seized in midair days before. The engine cowling was open, its guts exposed like a living creature on an operating table. The air smelled of hot aluminum and solvent. Evelyn rolled up her sleeves, wiped her hands on a rag, and laid out her tools. Micrometer, wrench set, a tin of graphite grease, and the tiny aluminum washer. "Hey, Mo," Dan asked quietly. "You got clearance for this?" She hesitated. Sort of. Sort of." She met his eyes. "It's either this or we keep sending them up to die." He didn't argue. The war had burned out most men's appetite for paperwork. He just nodded and handed her the linkage arm. "You never saw me," he said, turning away. Evelyn fit the washer into the throttle assembly, right between the pivot joint and the bracket. It was almost invisible, a shimmer of metal inside a world of grease and steel. She tightened the bolt until it seated just so, the play and the linkage gone. No more rattle, no more slack. The movement was clean now, smooth as breath. She felt a strange calm as she worked, the same calm her father used to have when fixing broken farm tools by lantern light. "Everything's got a rhythm," he'd say. "Find it, and it'll tell you what it needs." By 0900 hours, the fog had begun to lift. The squadron was preparing for a sweep over the channel. Escort duty for B-26 bombers bound for Calais. Lieutenant Carmichael, already in his flight gear, spotted her by the wing. "You've been at it since last night," he said. "What did you find?" She hesitated, then lied gently. "Just tightened a few things. Should run smoother now." He grinned. "Well, if she quits again, I'll just glide back on charm." She watched him climb into the cockpit, his gloved hands tracing familiar instruments. the sunlight catching on the roundel painted beneath the cockpit glass. He closed the canopy, gave a thumbs up, and the ground crew pulled the chocks. The Merlin engine roared to life, deep, throaty, flawless. Evelyn felt her chest tighten as the propeller blurred into a silver disk. "Blue flight, clear for takeoff," the controller called. The Spitfire rolled forward, tail lifting, and shot down the runway. Then another, and another. The field thundered with departures until the air vibrated with power. Evelyn shaded her eyes and watched them climb into the morning haze, tiny silver darts slicing through the clouds. An hour later, the radio shack came alive. "Blue 2 to Dunsfold, contact over Calais. Bandits at 10 o'clock high. Engaging." The voice crackled through static, clipped, urgent. Evelyn froze mid-step. Mechanics stopped what they were doing. Even the cooks leaned from the mess doorway. The next minutes stretched like hours, punctuated by bursts of radio chatter, position reports, warnings, then silence. Finally, Carmichael's voice cut through. "Blue 1 to Dunsfold. We've got 'em running. Repeat, Bf-109's disengaging, all aircraft accounted for, returning to base." The relief was a physical thing, like a weight dropping off every chest in the hangar. Someone laughed, someone else cheered. Evelyn just exhaled. She didn't notice the tears streaking the grease on her face. When the Spitfires touched down, the first thing Carmichael did was taxi straight to her bay. He jumped from the cockpit, still wearing his flight goggles. "She purred like a cat," he said, grinning. "Not a hiccup. Even when I pushed her to boost 8, she climbed clean. What did you do, Mo?" "Just listened," she said quietly. "She told me what she needed." He didn't ask further. In wartime, miracles didn't require explanations. He clapped her on the shoulder and jogged off to debrief. Evelyn stayed behind, her hand still resting on the warm metal skin of the Spitfire. For the first time in months, she felt hope. Fragile, like glass, but real. That evening, as the sun dipped over the airfield, she filed her routine maintenance sheet. In the remarks column, she wrote only 2 words: "Throttle adjusted." Nothing about washers, nothing about unauthorized fixes, just enough to keep her conscience and her pilots safe. But word travels fast on an airfield. Within days, mechanics from neighboring squadrons came by, curious about Carmichael's smooth-running Merlin. Someone called it Moore's fix. Someone else joked, maybe she should build the next Spitfire herself. She laughed it off, but deep down she knew the truth. The washer wasn't a miracle. It was a warning, a reminder that small things fail first, and that sometimes command was too far away to notice. She also knew it wouldn't stay secret forever. The RAF ran tight audits on modifications. Sooner or later, someone would notice the extra part and start asking questions. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight, the hangar was alive with the sound of laughter instead of silence. The air smelled of oil and victory instead of smoke. And Evelyn Moore, the woman who had risked her career for a 50-cent washer, finally allowed herself to breathe. RAF Dunsfold, November 1943. The weather had turned mean. The kind of English rain that didn't fall so much as hang in the air. Fine, relentless, and cold enough to bite through wool. Mud swallowed the edges of the runway. The hangars leaked. Coffee was served black because milk hadn't arrived in 2 weeks. The war, for all its thunder and noise, was mostly waiting. Waiting for takeoff orders, waiting for parts, waiting for word that someone you knew hadn't gone missing over France. Evelyn Moore stood under the dripping eaves of Hangar 3, staring at a clipboard she couldn't bring herself to sign. The paperwork said routine inspection. The rumor said otherwise. Rolls-Royce had sent an engineer to review unauthorized alterations discovered in field maintenance reports, and at the top of the list was Dunsfold, her airfield, She felt the first tremor of panic when she saw the man step out of the Jeep that morning. Arthur Kingsley, civilian liaison from the Rolls-Royce Aero Engine Division. His uniform wasn't military, but it might as well have been. Immaculate suit, polished boots, and an expression like a machine calibrated to find fault. He carried a black case of instruments and a folder marked Quality Assurance. "Miss Moore, I presume?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. Engineering Detachment, U.S. Air Forces." He smiled thinly. "Ah, the Americans. Always improving things." His tone made improving sound like tampering. He walked the line of Spitfires, examining each Merlin engine with surgical precision. Mechanics stood stiff as if facing inspection for parade. Evelyn followed in silence, her heart hammering with each aircraft he opened. She knew exactly what he would find. A half-inch aluminum washer tucked inside the throttle bracket of nearly every fighter on base. "Curious," he murmured after the fifth engine. "All these throttles show identical non-standard spacing. Not factory issue, not field approved. Who authorized this?" No one spoke. Rain ticked against the metal fuselage, steady as a clock. Finally, Dan Heller cleared his throat. "Must have been wear from the linkage, sir. We just tighten them when needed." Kingsley looked up, eyes sharp. "Tighten or modify?" Evelyn stepped forward. "It was me, sir." The hangar went silent. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "The linkage developed slack under boost. The throttle rod would bind. I added a washer to take up the play." He regarded her with a kind of polite disbelief, as though she'd confessed to mending a Stradivarius with duct tape. "A washer. You decided to alter the Merlin's throttle geometry. With a washer?" "Yes, sir." "Without approval?" "Yes, sir." He opened his notebook. "Do you have any idea the liability this presents? Unauthorized modifications void operational certification. If a pilot crashes because of this, the ministry will—" She cut him off, her voice quiet but steady. "If I hadn't done it, more would have crashed already." The words hung in the air like smoke. The mechanics stared at her, half admiring, half terrified. Kingsley blinked once, then snapped his case shut. "We'll see what London has to say," he said coldly, and walked out into the rain. That evening, the base commander called her into his office. Colonel Reeves was a fair man, worn thin by 2 years of endless operations. His desk was buried in dispatches, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Evelyn," he said, rubbing his temples, "they want you off the line until this is reviewed. Kingsley's filed a formal complaint. Says you compromised engine integrity." "Compromised?" she repeated, incredulous. "Sir, the modification fixed the problem. Ask the pilots." "I did," Reeves said quietly. "Every one of them swears the aircraft runs smoother since your fix. But paperwork doesn't care about feelings, and Rolls-Royce doesn't like civilians changing their engines." He leaned back, sighing. "Between you and me, I think you saved lives. But officially, I have to suspend you from direct maintenance until we get clearance." She nodded, throat tight. "Understood." "Stay on base," he added. "Don't make waves." The next days were torture. She could hear the Merlins roaring outside, engines she'd tuned with her own hands, and she wasn't allowed to touch a single one. She spent her hours drafting technical notes she couldn't submit, diagrams that would never leave her desk. War moved on without her. Squadrons flew, men died, weather changed. But Evelyn was stuck in a limbo of silence. Then came the news from Biggin Hill, another RAF station flying the same Spitfire variant. 3 aircraft lost in a single sortie, all engine failures under high boost. The official report: throttle linkage binding. Reeves slammed the paper on his desk when it arrived. "Damn it, it's the same issue." Evelyn's voice was steady. "Then let me fix it." He hesitated only a second before nodding. "Do it. But you never heard that from me." That night, she returned to the hangar. The lights were low. Rain drummed against the roof. She opened the tool chest, pulled out a handful of washers she'd cut weeks ago. polished, labeled, precise. She worked alone, moving from plane to plane, fitting them silently into place. The engines gleamed under her flashlight, their metal surfaces cold and perfect. She worked fast, her breath fogging in the chill. Every click of the wrench sounded like defiance. At dawn, when the first crews arrived, the work was done. 21 Spitfires stood ready, every one of them carrying her secret fix. The next sortie flew that afternoon. The weather cleared, visibility stretched all the way to the coast. Over the channel, they met a formation of Bf-109s head-on. In the operations shack, Evelyn listened to the radio, nails digging into her palms. Blue flight engaging. Climb rate good. Controls steady. Copy that, Blue 1. Keep them high. Then, a pause. Blue 2, we've got them turning. She's holding boost 9, smooth as silk. Laughter broke through the static. Relief. Triumph. Every aircraft returned that day. Not one lost. Colonel Reeves found her by the hangar door, soaked in rain, watching the planes taxi in. "Looks like your 50-cent miracle works," he said. She smiled faintly. "Let's hope the paperwork never catches up." But it would. In wartime, nothing stayed hidden for long. London, December 1943. The city still bore its scars. Whole blocks stood like broken teeth against the winter sky. Walls open to the wind, chimneys reaching into nothing. From the windows of the Rolls-Royce testing facility at Heston Aerodrome, Evelyn Moore could see the skeletons of burned-out factories beyond the fence, silent witnesses to what the war could do to metal, to cities, to people. Inside, everything smelled of polish, fuel, and cold air. Engineers in pressed uniforms moved about quietly, clipboards in hand. The test bay held a single Spitfire Bf-109, its silver skin gleaming under the lamps. On the engine cowling, freshly painted in yellow stencil, were the words, "Experimental, do not modify." The irony wasn't lost on her. Colonel Reeves stood nearby, looking more tired than usual, his greatcoat still wet from the drive. Kingsley was there too, the Rolls-Royce inspector who had tried to have her grounded. He looked at her as one might study a suspect, not a colleague. "Miss Moore," he said, tone clipped, "the ministry has authorized a supervised flight demonstration. You claim your adjustment improves throttle reliability at high boost." "I don't claim it, sir," she replied. "The pilots do." He didn't smile. "We'll see." The test pilot, squadron leader Peter Wainwright, was a quiet man with the kind of calm that came from surviving 30 sorties. He'd volunteered for this, partly curiosity, partly respect for the woman everyone on the flight line was whispering about. He walked around the aircraft once, hand brushing the fuselage like he was greeting an old friend. "Let's see what this washer of yours can do, Miss Moore," he said, half grinning. She nodded. "Just don't baby her. Push it past boost 9 if she'll take it." "Past 9, Kingsley scoffed. "You'll blow the supercharger." "Not if the linkage stays true," Evelyn said softly. At 1100 hours, the Spitfire rolled to the edge of the runway. The winter air shimmered in the exhaust heat. Mechanics stood back, fingers in their ears. The Merlin engine fired. One cough, one shudder, then a clean, rising growl that filled the hangar windows. Evelyn's pulse matched its rhythm. "Throttle to full," Reeves ordered. Wainwright nodded inside the cockpit, pushed forward on the control lever, and the Spitfire surged ahead, smooth, steady, perfect. The sound deepened, no sputter, no lag. She could hear it, the seamless pull of power through the band, every cylinder breathing evenly. The aircraft lifted off in a spray of mist and was airborne in seconds. Evelyn stepped outside, ignoring the cold. The sky was clear, washed pale by winter light. The Spitfire climbed hard, the propeller a blur, engine note rising until it became a single, pure tone. The radio crackled in the operations hut, Control, this is Test 1, passing 5,000. Boost steady, climb rate excellent. Kingsley scribbled notes without expression. Evelyn's hands were shaking. Taking her to altitude, the pilot's voice came again. Engaging boost 9, 9.5. Holding. No vibration. No hesitation on throttle return. She couldn't help herself. Ask him to push past 10, she whispered. Reeves gave her a look, half disbelief, half faith, then spoke into the mic. Test 1, increased to boost 10 for short duration. Copy that. The radio hissed, then came a laugh through the static. Small, incredulous. 10 and climbing. She's smooth as glass. Never felt a Merlin pull this clean. Evelyn closed her eyes. For a moment, the world vanished. The hangar, the cold, even the war. It was just the sound of a machine working the way it was meant to, a perfect harmony of metal and fire. Kingsley, though, still frowned. The test must include descent and throttle recovery, he said. That's where we've seen failures. Exactly, she replied. The Spitfire began its dive, slicing through the thin December air. The altimeter chatter filled the radio room. Descending through 15,000, throttle idle, boost cut, and a heartbeat of silence. Evelyn held her breath. Re-engaging, power restored, response immediate, no stickin', no lag. She's perfect. Cheers erupted in the control hut. Mechanics slammed fists on the tables, shouting over each other. Even Reeves let out a sharp exhale, grinning despite himself. Only Kingsley stood motionless, eyes fixed on the aircraft streaking across the horizon. When the Spitfire landed, its wheels kissed the runway like silk. Wainwright climbed down, face wind-burned but smiling. He pulled off his gloves and tossed them onto the wing. "I don't know what you did, Miss Moore," he said, "but that engine's never felt this alive. It's like she's breathing freer." Kingsley walked up, inspecting the throttle housing as if hoping to find a crack. Instead, he saw the small aluminum washer, perfectly seated, precisely machined. He tapped it with his finger, expression unreadable. 50 cents worth of metal, he murmured, and it solved a 2-year field issue. Evelyn said nothing. She just wiped her hands on her coveralls, grease smudging the fabric like war paint. He finally looked at her. "I'll file my report," he said quietly. "You'll get no credit, of course. These things get absorbed into design improvements." She gave a faint smile. "I didn't do it for credit, sir. I did it so they'd come home." That night, she sat on the edge of her bunk, the noise of aircraft fading in the distance. She'd done it. The washer had passed inspection. Tomorrow, Rolls-Royce would quietly issue a field bulletin authorizing reinforced throttle linkage spacers for all Merlin 61 and 63 engines. No one would mention her name. The document would read, "Implemented per engineering revision, December 1943. Outside, London burned faintly under blackout, the glow of 1,000 fires hidden behind clouds. But in the hangars at Dunsfold and Biggin Hill, Spitfires would soon run smoother, climb faster, live longer. Evelyn Moore had changed their fate, even if history never noticed. As she turned off the lamp, she whispered to herself, 50 cents well spent. England, spring 1944. The days grew longer, the skies louder. Dunsfold was now a living machine, metal, sweat, and hope in constant motion. The hangars overflowed with Spitfires, Mustangs, and Thunderbolts, each one tuned, fueled, and rushed back into the air. The war was shifting. Allied bombers were hammering the French coast ahead of the coming invasion. Everyone could feel it. Victory was still distant, but no longer impossible. For Evelyn Moore, life had returned to its steady rhythm of wrenches and reports. After the test flight at Heston, Rolls-Royce quietly changed the official maintenance manual. Throttle pivot spacing shall be reinforced by washer insert per revision 11B. No mention of who'd proposed it. No signature. Just another line of engineering text lost among hundreds. She didn't care much, at least not at first. What mattered were the numbers. Engine failures dropped by 37% in the first month. Pilots who used to dread high-boost climbs now called their aircraft singing birds. Every squadron that received the revised throttle assembly reported fewer accidents. It was subtle, statistical, but real. The Spitfire's reputation for agility and smooth power became legend in that final stretch of the air war. Sometimes she'd stand at the end of the runway and watch them go. Silver wings flashing in the sunlight, exhaust streaming like ribbons. She never stopped worrying. Every takeoff still felt like a promise she might not see kept. But now at least, the engines didn't betray them. The invasion came that June. The sky over southern England filled with more aircraft than anyone had ever seen. Squadrons layered like storm clouds. Spitfires, Mustangs, Typhoons, Dakotas. The air shook for hours as they crossed the channel. Evelyn watched from the hangar roof, wind whipping at her hair, the distant thunder fading toward Normandy. That summer was a blur of motion and exhaustion. Crews slept on toolboxes, engines ran until they glowed. She wrote dozens of letters for pilots who never came back, signed hundreds of maintenance logs, and kept cutting washers from whatever metal scrap she could find. They were still unofficial, of course, most of them installed by tired mechanics at night, quietly slipped into throttle housings without paperwork. No one called them Evelyn's washers. They were just washers, ordinary, anonymous. And yet they spread. By autumn, the same part number appeared in U.S. maintenance bulletins for the P-51 Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engines. Word had traveled across the ocean, a small field modification developed by RAF engineers. It wasn't true, not entirely, but she didn't correct it. The important thing was that it worked. By 1945, victory was finally in sight. Germany was collapsing. The skies over Europe belonged to the Allies. The hangars at Dunsfold grew quiet again. The engines still ran, but their sound no longer carried urgency, just habit. Mechanics packed up. Crates were labeled for return. Some pilots celebrated, some just stared at the ground, lost between relief and grief. Too many bunks were empty. Evelyn stood outside one last evening, hands in her pockets, watching the sunset burn orange through the clouds. The air smelled of grass and machine oil. A lone Spitfire sat at the far end of the field, its propeller still. Dan Heller walked up beside her. "Heard they're sending you back to the States," he said. "Yeah," she murmured. "Detroit wants its engineers again. You did good work here, Mo. Real good." She smiled faintly. "I just fixed a rattle, Dan." He shook his head. "You fixed more than that. You gave these boys a fighting chance." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the distant sound of a departing bomber, one of the last. The next morning, she boarded a transport plane home. No medals, no ceremony, just a sealed envelope from Colonel Reeves with a typed note inside. "Your modification has been adopted fleet-wide. Estimated 2,100 aircrew lives saved by improved throttle reliability. Thank you for refusing to wait. R." She folded the letter, tucked it into her journal, and never showed it to anyone. Post-war America, 1947. Factories returned to making cars. The world pretended to forget the sound of bombers. Evelyn went back to design work at a small manufacturing company in Michigan. She drew engine mounts and pump housings now. Quiet work, civilian work. Her colleagues knew she'd been with the Air Forces, but not what she'd done. She never brought it up. Once, a new engineer complained about a vibration issue in a tractor motor. Evelyn smiled, took a small washer from her drawer and said, "Try this. Sometimes the simplest fix is the one nobody writes down." He laughed, not realizing the weight of those words. Years later, when she married and moved to Chicago, the war felt like another lifetime. The Spitfires were in museums now, the men gray-haired. The manuals that once ruled her nights were gathering dust in archives, and the little aluminum washer, that sliver of metal that had changed everything, sat forgotten in a box of keepsakes under her bed. Every now and then she'd take it out, hold it to the light, and smile. Not with pride exactly, more like gratitude, because somehow she'd been given a chance to save lives without ever pulling a trigger. She kept the habit of touching that washer before every flight, even when flying commercial decades later. Superstition, maybe, or just memory. Cambridge, England, 1987. 44 years after the war ended, the archive room at the Imperial War Museum smelled of dust and old paper. Rows of gray metal drawers held the ghosts of an entire generation. Reports typed on onion skin paper, smudged flight logs, faded photographs. At a table under a flickering lamp sat Dr. Samuel Ellison, a young aviation historian working on a book about field modifications in Allied aircraft. His task was to trace how informal engineering, the improvisations of mechanics and pilots, had changed the course of the air war. It was tedious work. Endless forms, missing pages, names redacted. But one file, retrieved from a misfiled RAF box marked Dunsfold 1943-44, caught his eye. The heading read, "Throttle linkage, field adjustment, non-standard." Inside were a few maintenance reports stamped "Confidential," the ink faded but legible. One line, written by typewriter and corrected by hand in pencil, made him pause. Adjustment performed per Spec 11B. EM. He frowned. There was no EM in the list of authorized Rolls-Royce engineers. Curious, he dug deeper. The attached memo from a Colonel Reeves recommended, retaining the throttle washer improvement first identified at Dunsfold by American civilian personnel. No names, no citations, just initials. That night, Ellison couldn't shake the thought. He'd read hundreds of reports, but none this oddly personal. He began searching through secondary documents, requisition logs, workshop rosters, correspondence. Slowly, a name began to surface between the lines. Evelyn Moore, U.S. Army Air Force's technical liaison, mechanical engineer. She appeared only in the margins. One supply request here, a maintenance sign-off there. Always initials, never mention in the official engineering chain. But her handwriting matched the note in the Dunsfold file perfectly. The more he looked, the clearer the pattern became. After the appearance of EM's washer, Merlin engine failure rates plummeted. Reports from 1944 described improved throttle response under sustained boost, reduced stalling, and enhanced control during recovery. And then, just as suddenly, her name vanished from the record, absorbed into revisions, redrawn diagrams, new serial numbers. Ellison sat back, the sound of rain tapping the window pane. It hit him that he was probably the first person in 40 years to read her initials aloud. Chicago, United States, 1988. Through a mutual contact, he found her address. She was 71 now, retired, living quietly in a small brick house near Lake Michigan. The letter he sent was formal, almost apologetic. Dear Ms. Moore, I believe you were responsible for a field modification that became critical to the Merlin engine's reliability during 1943-44. I would be honored to confirm this for historical record. 2 weeks later, he received a reply, handwritten, neat, and brief. Dear Dr. Ellison, yes, that was me. But please understand, I didn't invent anything extraordinary. I just refused to watch pilots die over a loose bolt. History belongs to those who survive. I was lucky to help them do that. With respect, Evelyn Moore. There was no bitterness in her words, no demand for credit, just quiet finality. Ellison later visited her. She was frail but sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who still noticed the alignment of picture frames. When he mentioned that her simple washer might have saved more than 2,000 airmen, she smiled softly. Then it was worth the aluminum. she said. He asked if she'd kept any records, any drawings. She reached for a small wooden box on a shelf and opened it. Inside lay a single piece of metal, a washer worn smooth by years of handling. She held it like a relic, its edges catching the afternoon light. "This little thing," she said, "wasn't meant to make history. It was meant to make engines breathe right." He asked if she wanted him to publish her story. She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Publish the lesson, not the name," she said. "There are thousands like me. People who just saw something wrong and fixed it, that's enough." She passed away 5 years later. When her belongings were sorted, the washer was missing. Some said she'd been buried with it. Others thought she'd given it away. No one really knew. Imperial War Museum, 1994. In a small display case dedicated to uncredited innovations of Bf-109, Dr. Ellison placed a reproduction of that same washer beside a short placard. It read, "Anonymous Engineering Modification, 1943. A small aluminum spacer used in Merlin engines to stabilize throttle linkage. First observed at RAF Dunsfold. Credited with reducing in-flight failures and saving over 2,000 Allied pilots. Exact origin uncertain. Believed to be the work of a U.S. civilian engineer, initials EM." Visitors rarely lingered there long, just a glance before moving on to the larger exhibits. The tanks, the aircraft, the uniforms. But every now and then, someone would stop, lean in close, and read the final line engraved below the display. Sometimes, history changes not by command, but by the hands of those who simply refuse to watch others die. The camera would linger there, quiet music swelling, light glinting off the small ring of metal no bigger than a coin. Fade to black,